Sometimes it's necessary to make little summations, or metaphorically speaking, to put down a fence post in this endless chain of ours to give it support along the way. Not to say that this fence post is truth, although the science is verifiable, but merely to make a summation of what it is that's been occurring in these phases of this chain that's been going on for so many years. We know very well that saying, it's been quoted so very often. Take all perceptions, from the sensual, the aesthetic, and the transcendent levels of mind, and bring them to the subtle level of body, speech, and mind. The body of appearances, the speech of vibration, and the mind of awareness, from where those perceptions flow down the columns at the side of the spine, and then move up the central column to come out as our thoughts and our deeds. We know very well that this is a circle, like the other circuits, the circuit of our blood moving through our veins, the lymph, and so forth. So we know that this is a circle, and is therefore movement. So all of these levels of mind are movement. And we know that when we're in that subtle level, where the body, speech, and mind come together, this is called a state of satori, or living in a state of grace. But we know this is not the end of it, because we know now from our own experience that all of this movement has to have a forum, a place in which to take place. And that vehicle, that forum, that arena is stillness or silence. And then when we look at stillness or silence, it's not something. So these questions have been posed over the time to perhaps stimulate us to try to find what it is that happens when these two come together, because they're not separate. Fullness is not separate from emptiness. Emptiness is not separate from fullness. Stillness and silence is not separate from the movement that's taking place. So perhaps this story, this folk story, which is filled with sacred numbers and sacred symbols, will help us to make that fence post that we all need, a way station in our endeavors to understand who and what we are and how it works in our life. Yusio was a warrior, a great Japanese warrior, brave and intrepid, and he loved adventure. One day he decided that he was going to go out and seek further experiences. And so he took his two swords and strapped them around his waist. He took his quiver of arrows and slung it on his back. And he took his bow, which was bigger than himself, and slung it over his shoulder, and off he went. But he hadn't gone too far down the road when he came across a vast lake. A lake which was situated in front of two gigantic mountains. But across that lake there was a bridge. And he was just about to enter onto the span of the bridge when there in front of him covering the whole bridge crossing, was a huge dragon. It appeared to be asleep because there was a gentle snoring, and with each snore, flames and smoke came out of its nostrils. And its great claw was resting on the parapet of the bridge. Its scales, green, huge, were glistening in the sunlight. It looked like a very formidable creature. Yusio looked at it and recoiled. But then he was brave and intrepid, and he wanted to cross that bridge. So stepping out, he stepped right on the dragon. Crunch, 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 as he moved across its great back, until he stepped on the other side and was walking across the bridge. But just as he'd taken a few steps, a voice called his name. Yusio, Yusio. He turned around, and there, where the dragon had been, stood an old man, wearing a crown that looked somewhat like a dragon's head, a long beard, long hair, wearing a green-coloured gown. When Yusio looked at him, he could see that this was not an earthly creature. And he was standing right in the place where the dragon had been. But then Yusio stepped forward and eyeballed the old man and said, "Was it you who called me?" The old man said, "Yes, yes. I wonder if you would help me. I'm in dire need of a brave man. I've been taking the form of a dragon on this bridge for days and days and days, hoping that a brave soul would come along to come to my aid. But everyone who saw me ran in horror and fear, and you are the only one who have been intrepid enough to cross. Will you help me?" Yusio said, "I will endeavor to do what is ever in my power to do." And the old man said, "I am the Dragon King of this lake, and my family has been beset by a centipede, which devours my children and my grandchildren. Every day, every night, this creature comes and takes, and very soon there will be none of my family left, and I too will be devoured. Will you help me?" Yusio said yes. And with that, the Dragon King invited Yusio into his kingdom. And a very amazing thing happened. The water of the lake seemed to open as they entered, and Yusio was escorted deep, deep down into the depths of the darkness of the lake. But there, in front of him, was a magnificent palace, and he was invited in and feasted and feted. But then, as the day wore on and the evening came about, everyone began to recoil in horror, because the ground, even in that depth of the lake, began to shake. And the Dragon King said, "It's coming! It's coming!" And they went, and there, coming over the mountains they could see 2 great gleaming red balls. "That's its eyes," said the Dragon King. "Look." And as they looked, the feet of the centipede seemed to have lights, lamps, that glistened, and they could see it coiling behind the 2 great orbs. And the ground shook and quavered as its movement took place between the mountains. The Dragon King was visibly shaken, and all his children and courtiers had hidden in the hope of escaping being devoured. But Yusio calmly tried to placate the Dragon King, said, "Wait." And he took his arrows and his bow. But he noticed that he only had 3 arrows in his quiver. But he took the first and aimed it between the eyes, those 2 great orbs, as it got closer and closer, seeing the lights of its feet winding itself through the mountain. It hit the creature right between the eyes, but as they watched, it glanced off without touching. Yusio took the second arrow from his quiver and put it in his bow, and again let loose, and again it hit between the eyes but glanced off. Now the Dragon King, seeing this, was very afraid, and Yusio himself was a little rattled. But as Yusio stood there, suddenly he had the thought, a kind of remembrance. Somewhere he'd learned that human saliva was fatal to centipedes. So he resolutely took his final arrow from his quiver and placed it in his mouth, giving it a good coating of his spittle. Then he put it in his bow and let it loose. As they watched, the arrow pierced the brain of the centipede, and all of a sudden everything went dark, and great thunderous roars were heard throughout the whole of the earth and the underworld of the lake. But when all was settled, Yusio and the Dragon King looked, and there was the centipede floating belly up, dead, its blood having coloured the water of the lake. Needless to say, there was very great rejoicing in that kingdom. Yusio again was feasted and feted, but then it was time for him to go, because he knew that his family would be very concerned about his welfare, having been away for the time that he had. But as he was leaving, the Dragon King insisted that he take gifts with him. Now, Yusio did not wish to accept these gifts, nor to be laden with anything on his homeward journey. But the Dragon King insisted, and the gifts that were given to him were a bronze bell, a bag of rice, a bolt of silk and a cooking pot. Yusio went off down the road after the great rejoicing of those he'd left behind. And when he arrived home with his family, who were very glad to see him because he had been gone for longer than they'd anticipated, he showed them the gifts that he'd been given and told them the story. But the surprising thing that they discovered was the magic of the gifts. Strangely, it was not known what the magic of the bronze bell was, but it was given to the local temple, and in that temple it was used to ring the hours of the great rituals that were required by the religion of the day. And this it did so with great resonance and clarity. The bag of rice was found to never become empty. The more that was taken, the more it was filled. The bolt of silk, too, when it was cut, seemed to replenish itself. And as for the pot, whatever food was placed in it would be cooked to great deliciousness, but it never needed a fire in which to do its cooking. When we look at the symbols and the magic numbers of this story, we know. But how do we bring this to mind? How do we take out of the perceptions, the stories, the experiences of life when movement and stillness meet? How is it? What is it that arises? What is it that's like the bag of rice, the bolt of silk, and the pot that needs no fire, that allows us endlessly to have what we need in any given moment in whatever situation it is? Whether it be a words or a deed, to go into a fire, to savor another human being. What is it? Does this story help us to have an understanding of how it works for us? We don't need to know what it is, do we? Do we have to make something of it? Because our very life stands as an example of it. Just like was said on Thursday, bending over and baring our backside to show the welts and scars that have brought us to this place where we stand ever still, bringing forth whatever is needed at any given moment.